Okay, this is question 5C from CorbettMaths, solving quadratics by completing the square sheet. So when I look at this question, the first thing I notice is that we are not set up in this format, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Before you ever begin to complete the square, I'd recommend to you that you set everything equal to 0. That means to move everything in your equation just to one side of the equal symbol. It looks like almost everything is on the same side except for this value right here. But I will tell you the easiest thing to do typically is to keep x squared positive, okay? So I think some of you might look at this and say, oh, I'll just move 3x squared over by taking it away from both sides. However, this would give us something that looks like this. This goes away, obviously. This becomes negative x squared, and then I bring everything else down. The problem with that now is that it makes it very difficult for us to complete the square if I have this negative value in front of x squared. We cannot complete the square as we normally have done. So what I will do is actually take everything and move it to the opposite side of the equation since I now have 0 over here. So if I add x squared to both sides, I end up with x squared over here. If I take away x from both sides, I have minus x. And if I take away 7 from both sides, I would end up with minus 7 over here. And then everything on the right side has just come to 0. You can always do this with any equation. Just kind of swap the signs around as if you're taking away or adding everything to both sides. And then you just end up with all of the signs being flipped. This minus became a positive. This plus became a minus. And this plus became a minus. We just flipped every sign because we just moved it all over to the other side of the equation. All right. And now I do have this invisible 1 value in front of x squared that we prefer to have when we are completing the square. So it makes it pretty simple from here. All right, the only thing is that we have an odd number for our b value, which sometimes makes completing the square a little bit more complicated because we will have fractions or decimals, but that's okay. All right, so going from here, I'm going to move the c value over as I typically have done when we're completing the square. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is to find out what we need to add to both sides of the equation. All right, so I'm going to take the b value, which is a negative 1, divide it by 2, and then square it. All right, so that ends up giving me, I guess you could use the decimal. I'm going to keep it as a fraction in this case. This would be negative 1/2 times negative 1/2, which comes out to be positive 1/4. So I'm going to add 1/4 to both sides of the equation. All right, and then the next step is to factorize. Remember, we always end up with something in brackets squared, and then I can just choose the magic number, which is the b value that I had before I squared it. So I would use minus 1/2 here. And it works out, minus 1/2 times minus 1/2 gives me this, and minus 1/2 plus 1/2 gives me that minus 1 that I need. Okay, so always use that magic number if you think it's helpful. Here I'm going to simplify by adding these fractions together. 7 is the same thing as 28 over 4. I'm getting a common denominator there. And adding this 1/4, adding these together, I end up with 29 over 4. All right. Last thing is to solve by using square roots. So I take the square root of both sides. On the left-hand side, I bring down what was inside the brackets. And then on the right-hand side, I'm left with 29, the square root of 29 over 4. Don't forget the plus or minus, and everything here is inside of the square root. All right, let's take a look at that square root of 29 over 4. I want to simplify this as much as possible, so what I'm going to do is break this up into square root of 29 over the square root of 4, because now square root of 29 does not simplify. However, square root of 4 we do know is equal to 2. So I'm going to replace this down here below. So I have x minus 1/2 equals plus or minus, rewriting this as square root of 29 divided by 2. Okay, notice the 2 has now left the square root. The square root is only on the top bit of our fraction, okay? So that leaves me with one last step, which is to add the 1/2 over here to both sides of my equation. If I do that, I end up with 1/2 plus or minus square root of 29 over 2, like so. Okay, we could leave our answer this way. However, since we do have a common denominator here, it might be the case that they write this answer as 1 plus or minus the square root of 29 all over 2. Okay, that would also be acceptable. They might also break this apart into one plus answer and one minus answer, but I think you've seen enough of these problems worked out by now that you're comfortable knowing that this is the same thing as that answer broken up into two different pieces. Okay, keep practicing, keep going, good luck.